Hi everyone, I'm Shrey. I'm an applied scientist at Microsoft Research under the Special Projects Division. And the title of my talk today is Plural Publics. A very real question that I'm sure many here in the audience have started to think about is whether or not it is possible to live in a pluralistic society in a world where humans coexist with large foundation models. And by a pluralistic society, I mean a society that is free, a society that is self-governing, and a society that flourishes when there is participation in the context of diversity. And this question is very real and top of mind for policymakers, for AI pioneers, and citizens alike. And so in this talk, I'm going to be focusing on how we address that problem and how we can preserve democratic systems. A framing that I like to use, wait for this slide to go, but is known as a narrow corridor framing. The narrow corridor framing is a framing that balances both between centralization and chaos. The way you could think about centralization is concentration of power and illegitimate checks on authoritarianism. And chaos is when you have social fragmentation. And what we're starting to see today is immense amounts of centralization emerging in the top AI labs. We've started to see how a very small subset of engineers are capable of creating some of the most powerful transformational tech that humanity has ever seen. And they've been able to do so in a way with very limited democratic accountability in that process, in a way that has led to the emergence of immense amounts of concentration of power, information, and processing speed. When we start to relax the safety measures, we start to see how chaos can emerge. And this is more so to do in the open source foundation model space. In the open source foundation models, we started to see how models like Llama, Alpaca have started to lead to immense amount of deception. And both the speed and ease at which these models can cause deception has started to cause a tremendous amount of issues. I'm not really sure where my slides are, so I'm going to keep just talking over it for now. Okay, there, yeah. And modern liberal democracies rely on three key principles. There's a sense of identity, there's a sense of property, and a sense of voting. And they take shape in many different forms. In some modern liberal democracies, you see how identity maps from a birth certificate all the way up to a health card, to a passport. In the land sense, you see how it takes shape in the physical land context or the data context in modern sense. And finally, there's a sense of collective decision-making, whether it take place in civic elections or internet polling. Today, all three of these are under threat. And we're starting to see how different AI leaders around the world are actually trying to critique that problem. And instead of me, who may be conveniently trying to be an adversary to this problem, we can start to see how even the people who have the most to gain are critiquing this problem. As an example, Sam Altman, who's the founder and CEO of OpenAI, has echoed the problems that large foundation models can have to strengthening authoritarian regimes, and that we need to start building these models in a more democratic way. We've also seen other policy leaders talking about the fall of democracy and gathering some of the most senior CEOs of all the big tech companies to start to put together a policy towards this. Okay, technology and democracy have seemingly been in tension with one another for the past couple of decades. In the past, we saw how democratic systems were some of the best developers of novel technology, whether it be the internet, lasers, or GPS. But now, we're starting to see some of the best technology emerge from private institutions. And that corridor between centralization and chaos is narrowing, and narrowing in a way that's getting concerning. And so what I'm going to be presenting today is this vision of plurality that our lab focuses on, which is this vision of finding consensus across difference and widening that vision between centralization and chaos. Plurality is grounded on a lot of different social theory, whether it be the secrets literature from Georg Simmel, the writings from J.C.R. Licklider, who is the founder of ARPANET, the precursor to the modern internet, as well as John Dewey, who's an American philosopher that wrote a lot about how we can collectively deliberate to find solutions to collective problems. And these leaders of today's plurality vision is being led by both Audrey Tong, the digital minister of Taiwan, as well as Glenn Weil, who's the research director of the lab that I belong to at Microsoft Research, along with a variety of different academic labs across the world. including Harvard, Getting Plurality Network, Berkeley, Center for Responsible Intelligence, and the other names listed here. An example of the plurality work that you may be familiar with in the Ethereum ecosystem or the Web3 ecosystem is quadratic voting. Quadratic voting was developed by Glenn and others, where the goal of this was to find as much consensus or representation across differences and reward those differences in a way that is proportional to that difference. And we've seen examples of the power that this has had in the Gitcoin community. Right now, though, and as we've started to learn, is that we know that democratic systems rely on participation. And we know that it relies on having voice and incentivizing voice in many ways. But as we're starting to see, participation is at risk. We no longer know how we can trust public commentary. We don't know whether emails or letters were generated by the people who are actually writing them. So senators don't know whether or not they're actually putting forth policy that's representative of its own citizens. And town halls in internet-based polling mechanisms are no longer sufficient or credible if we're unable to verify that those people are in fact the people we say that they are. And so the focus of our work is to do two things. One, how can we find new ways to enhance participation, because large foundation models actually have a lot of opportunity here to reshape the way we think about democracy. They have the ability to potentially have long, global, instantaneous participation in a way that democratic theorists or reformers could only imagine. But they're only important if we can verify that that voice and input is actually what they say it is to be. And if we can do that, then maybe we can get to this vision of plurality that we've been envisioning. And so the core focus is to look at how has this changed in the emergence of the internet in the past 20 years. The internet, to many, is currently viewed as one of the most promising revolutions in human communication. It's allowed people to communicate across the globe at speeds we could only once imagine, and allow people to do so long as they have an internet connection. But the internet has actually hindered our ability to communicate with one another effectively. The reason being is that it doesn't preserve context when we communicate with one another. Context is the critical part of human communication, and context is under threat now because we no longer know what's real or what's fake. And so when the Bitcoin community started to talk about don't trust, just verify, being this very niche quote in this culture, it's now becoming mainstream because we can no longer trust and we have to verify information if we want to be able to participate in democratic systems. And so when I said context is everything, what exactly is context? Well, context is precisely the symbols and language we use to communicate with one another. The only reason you are all understanding what I'm saying is because we all have some consensus around the English language. We all have some assumptions we made when you came in to listen to this talk around what the style of speaking or the framing of it is going to be under, something to do with Ethereum or EDCON or Web3 of the sort. And we can see how context is critical to human communication, because without it, we are unable to converse with one another. And so if we can't preserve context, we can't communicate with one another. And context is under threat. So much so that we've had so many different authors in the social science space write about it and talk about the impacts that it's had on networked teens, along with the way we shape privacy, as well as our secrets. Dana Boyd, who's a coworker of mine at Microsoft Research, wrote the book, It's Complicated, and talks a lot about the impact that the internet and social media platforms have had on the inability to preserve context for teens. When someone posts something on Instagram or Twitter, they may post it with a given assumption around what they wanted it to mean to someone. But when someone else views it, their expectations, their dispositions, and the way that they view that content is very different. Helen Nissenbaum has tried to reshape the way we define privacy. Privacy is not this binary thing between I do share or I don't share. Privacy is contextual. What may be private to you may not be private to someone else, but it may be private to another person. So our privacy should be viewed in this very contextual way. And Georg Simmel has talked about the power of secrets on strengthening our relationships with one another, which will become important at the later parts of this talk. Context is under threat in many ways, and as we've started to see here, where we can no longer trust the voice of our loved ones anymore. If I have a picture of your face and 3 seconds of your voice, I can create a pretty credible version of you in a way that we've seen in scams can persuade someone's grandmother to give their supposed granddaughter $21,000. And these scams are only starting to emerge in much more persuasive ways. So if your face and your voice is no longer meaningful as a way to preserve your identity online, how are we going to start to communicate with one another and trust one another? So recently, our team published this paper in the Harvard Ethics Journal titled Plural Publics, which offers a framework for how we believe we should be thinking about both the privacy frameworks along with how we can build communication channels online to be able to have integrity with one another. We actually think that AI might be the precise attack we've always needed to communicate with one another more effectively. For the better part of the 2000s, privacy has always been this nice to have. The reality is none of us change our passwords as frequently as we should, and we don't care enough to tell our parents or our friends to do that as well. But privacy goes from this nice to have to this necessity, because if you lose the key parts of your identity, you may no longer be able to authenticate yourself in the digital world. You may no longer be able to access your bank account, communicate with your friends, or communicate with your parents in the digital world. And so now privacy goes from this nice to have to a much more of a necessity. And so this Plural Publics paper tries to offer a framework for defining what exactly an incredibly high information integrity space could look like. And we take the framing from John Dewey, who's a 1920s American philosopher that had this book titled The Public and Its Problems. And in this book, he defines this idea of emergent publics. Emergent publics are spaces where people come together to deliberate and talk about how to solve problems for issues that are pressing against a very specific set of people. J.C.R. Licklider, who's the, that slide was missing. J.C.R. Licklider, who is the father of the ARPANET, which is also known as the precursor to the modern internet, had this idea of building upon the initial vision of Dewey's emergent publics. And J.C.R. Licklider was unable to do so in a way that we wanted to now talk about. And so there was 5 key tools on that slide previous that we started working on to build towards. And so Jaron Lanier, who's a researcher at Microsoft as well, had this post titled, How to Fix Twitter and All of Social Media. And a lot of it was focused on how we need to start communicating in more group chats instead of these broad-based social platforms like Twitter or Instagram. Group chats come with this very interesting idea of reputation and social cost to communication. When I enter a group chat with someone on iMessage, Signal, Telegram, whatever it may be, it's mapped to this global identifier, my phone number in this context potentially, that people can penalize if I operate in a very harmful way. And what is harmful? Harmful is contextual. So if I show up into my group chat with my family and start communicating in a way that is very different from my friends, my family may look at that username in a very different way. But what's important here is that the reason why we think group chats are incredibly important is because it's really easy to delineate whether or not someone's using an artificial version of themselves or not in a way that respects social norms. So as an example, in this room here, if we had some inside joke about the blue chairs in this room and I started using an AI to communicate with one of you that didn't pick up on that joke, then you would know that it's not picking up on some contextual cue or symbol that our relationship had with one another. Another really important primitive that we released earlier this year is this idea of what's known as a designated verifier signature. A designated verifier signature says if I send you a message, you should be the only person who can verify that message, and no one else in the world should be able to verify it. The reason why that's really important is because it's for 2 reasons. One of which is you should be the only person because you are the contextual individual that I've assumed has all of the assumptions to interpret that information. Meaning, if I post something on Twitter, maybe I should post it to the people who were at EDCON instead of all of my Twitter followers because they didn't share that same experience of being in this room when something may have happened. The second reason is that AI labs are actually incentivized to now verify the data that they train on. Not for any purpose of creating better models, but purely because today, GPT-4, Llama, or all these other tools are built on this distribution of human language that is actually human for now. But as these models start to pollute the internet more and more, we're no longer going to know what is representation of the human corpus and an artificially generated corpus. But if we can verify through these types of signature schemes that we believe are quite powerful, that something is actually human-generated, then AI labs will be incentivized to pay for that information in a way that also preserves information integrity for the communicator. For time purposes, we'll skip over the circuit. There's also a really important power that blockchains have in being able to create what's known as common knowledge. Common knowledge is this idea of I don't just know something, you don't just know something, but I know that you know that I know something. And that is really powerful when it comes to contextual communication. I don't want to just know that you know English. I want you to know that I know that you know English so that I will actually communicate in English. And there's this sense of common knowledge that is critical for coordination purposes, that is really important in supply chain, military sense, but also even just coordinating our everyday actions that we believe a blockchain can be very powerful in enhancing. Finally, we did a lot of work last year on creating identity certificates because we don't know the state today of what primitives are useful for verifying someone's identity. There is this centralized view that maybe scanning someone's iris or having OAuth dependent on one platform, and there's this more chaotic view in having attestations across various different types of platforms in the Web3 ecosystem. We don't know what the answer is today, but we know that we need to be exploring it in a way that enhances privacy, in a way that preserves context, in a way that we can feel is credible. And so we did some work on that here as well. We put together a lab today. It's one of the largest research labs that's working on this specific problem at Microsoft Research. It's called the Plural Tech Research Collaboratory, with over 100 researchers focusing on this very specific problem of preserving information integrity, along with various other sets of research problems in the Web3 and AI adjacent space. Some of the ideas that we've been thinking about now, or specifically my research has been focusing on, is how can we preserve the integrity of collectives' identities? So we know that these large foundation models are incredibly powerful. What if each DAO could have their own AI of themselves and monetize that DAO's AI and protect the integrity of that DAO? So what does that even mean? It means if I took all the conversations, all of the metrics, all of the data that our DAO created in our Discord chats or Telegram chats or Slack chats, whatever it may be, and use that data in a way to strengthen the power of an LFM, an open source LFM, through this process known as reinforcement learning with human feedback, maybe, and just maybe, we could actually create an AI for each DAO in a way that those DAOs actually own. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with reinforcement learning with human feedback, it's what actually took these large foundation models from being able to predict next tokens to being able to mimic human-like performance. And a lot of that process focuses on fine-tuning on human-like data or having human annotators label the outputs of these models. So instead of having arbitrary OpenAI humans label that data, why don't we have our own DAOs label that data and own the AI that emerges from that data? The other part of this is identity data. We need to be thinking more about how the identity data that we have can be used to both authenticate ourselves in a way that doesn't take on this very centralized view as I talked about before. There's this idea of what's known as intersectional social identity, which says that instead of taking just one attestation, and whether it be a government credential or a biometric scan, let's take the intersection of many attestations. And the intersection of those attestations is what will actually have a much higher probabilistic estimate with more credibility for you to be a unique human than otherwise. Secondly, we need to think more about contextual communication flows. Today, when I post something on Twitter, I really only have two options. I can post to everyone, or I can post to my close friends list. You see similar style of private versus public forums on Instagram with your private story versus your public. We need to be thinking about more contextual ways of posting in a way that people can verify and preserve the integrity of that information. Maybe I want to post to my close friends and everyone at EDCON or close friends and Gitcoin contributors. And it should be done in a way that is designated verifier, so only those people can verify that message and no one else will have any assumptions or judgments towards that information when I post about it. And so what does the future of our research look like? The future of our research is focusing on building context-preserving technologies. It's focused on guiding policy. And finally, running experiments in communities and DAOs that want to start working with these context tools. The final thought I want to leave people with is this idea that our secrets are our Turing tests. Today, if you ever heard of CAPTCHA, CAPTCHA is this way of looking at someone and determining whether or not they're a human or a bot. And a CAPTCHA, it takes on this very frequentist approach of saying, in this very moment, can you solve this puzzle? And if so, then you are probably not a robot. Those puzzles are now mundane and no longer sufficient for determining whether or not someone's a human. Your face is not even sufficient for determining whether or not you're a human. And nor is your voice even sufficient for determining whether or not you're a human. we may need to start looking at our prior informations, our secrets, to start determining whether or not someone is a human. Because the only thing we can determine about one another is the shared memories we share with each other. Those shared memories are the things that we can start to use to authenticate. The fact that I shared a meal with you and the wine spilt on the floor, and that, like, these types of memories are the things that we're going to start to emerge. And so if this work is very interesting to you and you feel called to contribute to it, please do follow me on Twitter or Substack or reach out to our team. We have a lot of open source projects, both in the Web3 community and AI spaces, that we're looking for more people to contribute to. And thank you.